In the desolate expanse where the earth swallowed men whole, a lone woman's mercy bloomed, a fragile defiance against the unforgiving wild. This is a story of a silent pact, forged in the terror of quicksand, and the thunderous echo it cast across a fractured land. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind, a relentless sculptor, carved the landscape into a canvas of harsh beauty, where the horizon shimmered under an unforgiving sun. Sarah, a woman forged from the same stubborn dust, moved with the quiet efficiency of one who had learned the land's brutal lessons. Her home, a rough-hewn cabin, clinging to the edge of a vast, indifferent prairie, was less a dwelling and more a testament to survival. Each morning, she woke to the same deafening silence, punctuated only by the distant cry of a hawk or the rustle of dry grasses. It was a life of stark solitude, chosen not by desire, but by the cruel hand of circumstance, a fate she bore with a stoic resignation that had calcified over years of hardship. The world beyond her small clearing was a realm of unspoken dangers, of encroaching settlements and ancient grievances, a duality that made her existence a precarious balance. She kept to herself, her past, a shadow that lengthened with each passing year, and her future, an unwritten page she dared not ponder. Her hands, calloused and strong, knew the intimate language of the soil, the quiet desperation of a spring gone dry, the fragile hope born from a sudden, unexpected rain. This was her world, narrow yet infinitely deep, where every breath was a whisper against the vastness, every heartbeat a drum against the silence. It was on one such morning, as the sun began its slow, inevitable climb, casting long, deceptive shadows across the treacherous lowlands, that she stumbled upon the maw of the earth, a shimmering liquid mirror reflecting the indifferent sky, a quicksand bog known to claim unwary wanderers. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her practiced composure, for this was a danger she understood intimately, a deceptive beauty that promised oblivion. But then, a sound, a faint, desperate struggle, rippled across the viscous surface. A boy, no older than 10, his skin the color of rich earth, was sinking slowly, irrevocably into the hungry maw of the earth. His wide, terrified eyes, darker than any shadow, met hers across the shifting, deadly expanse. He was a Comanche, a child of the people her kind had been taught to fear, to despise. The very air around him seemed to hum with the unspoken tension of a world torn apart. Yet in that moment, all that mattered was the swift, undeniable pull of the earth itself, threatening to swallow him whole. The boy's struggle was a silent testament to sheer terror, his small arms flailing with a frantic energy that only hastened his descent. Sarah's breath caught, a cold, metallic taste on her tongue. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn away, to retreat to the safety of her isolated world, to let the unforgiving land claim its due. The whispers of the fearful, bigoted tales she'd heard since childhood clawed at her, painting this child as the enemy, a harbinger of violence. Yet, beneath the layers of ingrained prejudice, a deeper, more human instinct pulsed. His eyes, wide and luminous with a despair that transcended language, mirrored a vulnerability she recognized in herself, a shared fragility in the face of nature's brutal indifference. The viscous mud was already past his waist, clinging to him like a hungry shroud, its slow, inexorable pull a chilling metaphor for the forces that sought to divide and destroy. She knew the mechanics of quicksand, the deadly deception of its surface. Panic would be his undoing. Her mind, a whirlwind of calculated risks and gut-wrenching fear, raced. There was no time for hesitation, no room for the luxury of moral debate. She dropped her gathering basket, the dried herbs scattering like forgotten promises, and began to move, not towards him, but around the periphery, searching for something, anything, to bridge the deadly gap. A fallen log, thick and weathered, lay half-buried near the bog's edge, a silent witness to countless, unseen tragedies. With a grunt, she wrestled it free, the effort straining muscles long accustomed to solitude. The wood was heavy, unyielding, much like the burdens she carried. She shoved it forward, inch by painful inch, its rough bark scraping against the earth, until one end reached the desperate boy. His gaze, still locked with hers, held a flicker of something she dared not name. A nascent hope, fragile as a spider's silk. She extended her hand, her arm outstretched, the gesture a bridge between two worlds, two warring peoples. "Hold on," she rasped, the words raw, foreign even to her own ears, a sound rarely uttered in her solitary life. He reached, his small fingers surprisingly strong as they gripped her wrist. A lifeline in a sea of liquid death. The quicksand tugged, a relentless, greedy force, and she braced herself, her feet sinking slightly into the softer earth at the bog's edge. The world narrowed to the desperate rhythm of their combined struggle, the boy's frantic gasps, her own ragged breaths, and the ominous gurgle of the mud. This was a moment suspended in time, stripped bare of all but the primal will to survive. A silent, tense ballet between life and oblivion, where a simple act of shared vulnerability transcended a lifetime of ingrained hostility. The boy, pulled from the grasping maw of the earth, lay trembling on the sun-baked ground, his small chest heaving with ragged, wet coughs. The quicksand had coated him in a thick, dark slime, a grotesque second skin that spoke of his near oblivion. Sarah, equally spent, knelt beside him, her own heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the vast silence of the prairie. She studied him, her gaze piercing, yet devoid of the usual fear that laced the interactions between her kind and his. His eyes, now clear of terror, held a profound weariness, a knowledge of suffering that belied his young age. He was a child, yes, but one forged in a crucible of survival, much like herself. The raw, desperate humanity of their shared ordeal had stripped away the layers of societal hatred, leaving behind only the stark reality of two beings teetering on the edge of a desolate landscape. She offered him a small, tattered canteen, its leather worn smooth from years of use. He hesitated, his eyes flicking from the water to her, a flicker of inherent caution born from generations of mistrust. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her gesture. He drank deeply, the water sluicing down his throat, a sound almost as profound as the silence that had preceded it. The sun beat down, hot and unyielding, urging them to move. Leaving him there, exposed and vulnerable, was not an option, though the thought of bringing him to her cabin, a veritable fortress of her own fragile peace, sent a shiver down her spine. The consequences of such an act, if discovered, were a dark, unnameable terror. Yet, the image of his face, so young and afraid in the quicksand's grasp, burned bright in her mind, eclipsing the shadows of potential reprisal. It was an unspoken decision, a silent covenant sealed in the heart of the wilderness. She rose, her muscles protesting, and gestured towards her cabin, a distant speck against the hazy horizon. He understood, a flash of recognition in his eyes, and with a silent, almost ethereal grace, he pushed himself up, still covered in the drying mud, a living statue carved from the earth itself. They walked, a strange, mismatched pair, through the whispering grasses, the silence between them thick with the weight of unspoken histories, of past atrocities and future uncertainties. Each step was a defiance, a silent prayer against the prevailing winds of prejudice. The cabin, when they reached it, seemed smaller, more exposed, as if the very act of bringing him inside had torn a hole in the fabric of her carefully constructed solitude, exposing her to a world she had diligently sought to avoid. Her cabin, a sanctuary of dust and quiet contemplation, felt suddenly too small, too vulnerable, with the boy inside. He sat on a rough-hewn stool near the hearth, where a perpetual fire kept the chill at bay, his gaze sweeping over her meager possessions with an unnerving intensity. It was a space that had echoed only her own thoughts for years, a refuge born from the ashes of a life brutally upended. The silence, once a comfort, now hummed with an unfamiliar tension, a silent question she couldn't answer. She fetched a basin of water, clear and cold from the well, and a piece of coarse linen. Without a word, she began to clean the drying mud from his skin, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. His small body, wiry and strong, stiffened at her touch, but he didn't resist, his eyes, dark and fathomless, watching her with a primal wariness. This was the son of the Comanche, a people whose very name sent tremors of fear and resentment through the settlements. She remembered the stories, the gruesome accounts whispered around campfires, of raids and retribution, of painted faces and ruthless efficiency. They were the shadows at the edge of the known world, feared and demonized, a constant threat to the fragile peace of her own kind. Yet this boy, stripped bare of his cultural trappings by the quicksand's embrace, was simply a child, vulnerable and alive because of her. It was a searing irony, a stark contradiction to the narratives that had shaped her perception of them. Flashback. Years earlier. Asterisk. The wind, a cruel accomplice, carried the scent of smoke and fear. Sarah, then just a young woman, watched from the thicket as her family's homestead, a lifetime of toil and hope, became a roaring pyre. The distant shouts, a chaotic symphony of violence, echoed in her ears, a memory forever seared into her consciousness. It had been a settler dispute, a land claim gone bloody, but the stories that spread through the panicked remnants of their community were of savage attacks, of the Comanche menace. The truth was murky, deliberately obscured by fear and blame, but the outcome was undeniable. Her family gone, her life shattered, and the wilderness her only escape. She had built her solitude brick by painful brick, a fortress against the world's unpredictable cruelty. She remembered the hollow ache in her chest, the desperate scramble to bury her dead, the gnawing emptiness that had driven her far into the unknown. This was why she lived alone, why the vast expanse of the prairie was both her prison and her sanctuary. This was why the boy's presence, the son of the very people her community blamed for so much suffering, felt like a direct confrontation with the ghosts of her past. The ingrained fear was a knot in her gut, a constant companion. Yet the boy's silent trust, the way his eyes followed her every move, began to unravel the tightly wound threads of her prejudice. She knew the societal narrative, the way it twisted truth into convenient hatred. She had seen it firsthand, the way fear could turn neighbor against neighbor, just as easily as it could turn white against red. The act of saving him was a defiant whisper against the roaring storm of history, a quiet rebellion against the inherited bitterness that sought to define her. The next day passed in a quiet rhythm, a strange dance between two beings from disparate worlds. The boy, whose name she still didn't know, slowly shed his wariness, a subtle thawing in his gaze. He moved with a quiet grace, his eyes constantly absorbing, learning the contours of her small world, much like a young wild creature observing a new territory. She watched him, an unspoken curiosity blooming within her, replacing the initial fear. He helped her with small tasks, fetching water from the well with surprising strength, gathering firewood with an intuitive understanding of the land's offerings. There was no need for words. Their communication, a tapestry woven from gestures, shared glances, and the soft sounds of daily life. He pointed to the sun, then held up 3 fingers, a silent question about its duration, a subtle hint at his eventual departure. She understood. 3 days. The thought of his leaving stirred a complex brew of emotions within her. Relief, for the perilous secret she harbored would soon vanish, and a strange, nascent loneliness, a flicker of connection she hadn't realized she craved. The isolation of her cabin, usually a balm, began to feel like a cage. The secret of the Comanche boy simmered beneath the surface of her quiet routine, a constant, low thrum of anxiety. Every shadow, every distant sound, seemed to carry the threat of discovery. She knew the swift, brutal justice that awaited any settler found harboring a savage. The whispers of vengeful mobs, the fiery sermons of itinerant preachers, condemning any act of kindness towards the heathen, echoed in the quiet chambers of her mind. This was a land where survival often hinged on adherence to rigid, unforgiving codes, where compassion could be a fatal weakness. The boy, recuperating, seemed to sense the underlying tension, his movements growing more deliberate, his watchful eyes darting towards the horizon, as if already anticipating his departure. He drew patterns in the dust with a twig, intricate symbols she couldn't decipher, yet which held a silent eloquence, speaking of a world beyond her comprehension, a culture rich and ancient. She saw in his face the faint traces of the people who had claimed this land long before her kind arrived, a proud lineage etched into the very bone structure. It was a profound realization, that beyond the fear and the prejudice, there was a humanity, a spirit, that transcended the brutal conflicts of their respective worlds. She found herself learning, not just about him, but about the deeply ingrained biases that had shaped her own perceptions. The quiet passing of each day, measured by the sun's steady arc, built a strange, fragile bond between them, a silent understanding born of shared vulnerability and an unspoken reliance. He was a temporary anchor in her solitary existence, a small, vibrant presence that brought a flicker of warmth to her often chilled heart. But with each passing hour, the impending separation loomed larger, a shadow growing with the fading light. She found herself dreading the moment he would slip back into the vast unknown, not just for the silence he would leave behind, but for the question mark his return, or lack thereof, would etch into her soul. The memory of his face, terrified in the quicksand, now mingled with the image of his quiet strength, a stark contrast to the fears that had once consumed her. The risk she had taken, an impulsive act of raw human compassion, now felt like a dangerous thread, stretching taut across the chasm between two warring peoples, waiting for the inevitable snap. On the third day, as the sun dipped towards the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple, the boy stood at the threshold of her cabin. His gaze, unblinking, met hers, holding a mixture of gratitude and a quiet resolve. He pointed to the setting sun, then to himself, and finally made a sweeping gesture towards the distant lands, a silent declaration of his departure. There were no words, only the weight of unspoken farewells. He was a shadow slipping back into the wilderness from which he had emerged, a phantom of mercy in a landscape defined by harshness. Sarah watched him go, a strange ache in her chest. It was not sorrow, not entirely, but a profound sense of emptiness, a void where the quiet presence of another human being had briefly resided. The cabin, which had felt too small with him in it, now seemed impossibly vast, echoing with a silence that felt heavier, more absolute than before. The risk had been immense, the potential consequences dire, and yet she felt no regret. Only the quiet, lingering question, what would become of him, and what would become of her, now that she had crossed an invisible line, had offered kindness where society demanded enmity. The prairie stretched out, an endless expanse of whispering grasses, indifferent to the quiet drama that had unfolded within her small dwelling. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows, mirroring the uncertainty that now stretched before her. The world seemed to hold its breath, poised on the edge of an unseen precipice. She walked to the edge of her clearing, her gaze fixed on the point where the boy had vanished, swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape. The wind, a constant companion, rustled through the dry stalks, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant possibility. She stood there for a long time, a solitary figure against the vast canvas of the twilight, her heart a tangled knot of fear and a strange, burgeoning hope. The silence that had once defined her existence now felt like a vacuum waiting to be filled, either by the sweet release of continued solitude or the thunderous roar of an unforeseen consequence. The open loop of his departure left her vulnerable, exposed, and utterly alone with the terrifying knowledge that she had defied the unwritten laws of her world. The air grew cooler, carrying a hint of the night's chill, and still she remained, a sentinel of silent apprehension, listening for any sound that might break the overwhelming quiet. The 3 days that followed stretched into an eternity, each hour a separate, leaden weight dragging at the fragile threads of her composure. The silence of her cabin, once a comforting cloak, had transformed into an oppressive shroud, thick with anticipation. Every gust of wind rattling the shutters, every distant cry of a coyote, sent a jolt of fear through her. An instant image of a returning war party, painted faces, and the cold glint of steel. Her mind, usually a fortress of practicality, became a theater for dark imaginings. She saw the judgmental stares of unseen settlers, the condemnation in their eyes for her forbidden act of compassion. She envisioned the furious patriarchs, the rigid matriarchs, their faces set hard with righteous anger, their voices rising in a chorus of accusations. They were the societal figures, the stereotypical embodiment of a community that clung to its prejudices like a lifeline, quick to judge, quicker to condemn. The landscape itself seemed to conspire against her peace. The sun, a relentless eye, burned down with an unusual ferocity, heating the air until it shimmered, distorting the horizon into menacing mirages. The endless stretch of the prairie, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a vast, exposed stage, where she stood alone, awaiting her fate. Sleep offered no respite. Nightmares of quicksand and hostile faces haunted her fitful rest, leaving her even more exhausted than before. She moved through her days with a mechanical efficiency, her hands performing familiar chores while her mind raced, replaying the encounter with the boy, dissecting every glance, every gesture, searching for a sign, an omen. Had she made a grave mistake? Had her empathy sealed her doom? The irony of her situation gnawed at her. She had saved a life, an act universally lauded, yet in this brutal land, within the rigid confines of their hatreds, it was a transgression of the highest order. The very air around her seemed to vibrate with an unseen tension, a pregnant pause before a storm. She watched the horizon, her gaze sweeping across the vast expanse, searching for any telltale dust cloud, any unusual movement. The repetition of this vigilant observation became a torment, a slow-burn agony that chipped away at her resilience. She was a single, vulnerable heart, exposed to the elements, waiting for the echo of a mercy she had offered to return either as a blessing or a curse. The solitude she had embraced now felt like a cruel joke, amplifying her fear, leaving her utterly alone with her growing dread. A dark and heavy weight pressed against her chest. Then, on the afternoon of the third day, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson, the earth began to hum. It was a low, resonant vibration that began subtly, a faint tremor underfoot, barely perceptible at first, then growing, gaining momentum. It was the sound of distant thunder, not from the heavens, but from the very ground beneath her. Sarah, perched on her porch, her heart a knot of anxious dread, felt it deep in her bones. The air grew thick, heavy with the dust that began to rise, a shifting ochre cloud on the distant horizon. Her breath caught in her throat. She gripped the rough-hewn rail of her porch, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. The silence of the prairie was violently torn apart by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a growing crescendo that vibrated through the very air, a thunderous roar that swelled with terrifying speed. It was not one rider, nor a handful. It was a multitude. The dust cloud grew, enveloping the distant tree line, a terrifying manifestation of her deepest fears. They came, a surging tide of dark shapes against the dying light, horses and riders appearing as if conjured from the very earth. The initial terror was a cold, paralyzing wave, stripping her of all thought, leaving only primal, instinctual dread. This was it, the reckoning, the vengeance. Her mind flashed through images of escape, futile and desperate. Where would she go? The vastness offered no sanctuary from such numbers. She stood frozen, a lone sentinel against the encroaching tide, her small cabin a fragile, exposed target. The thunder of hooves grew deafening, shaking the very foundations of her world. Then, as the mass of riders drew closer, their forms coalescing into discernible figures, a terrifying sight took shape. It was not a small raiding party, but an entire village on the move. Horses laden with supplies, travois dragging behind them, women and children among the riders, their faces stark and impassive. And at the head of the procession, mounted on a magnificent stallion, rode a figure of imposing stature, his face etched with authority, his bearing radiating an undeniable power. A chief. Her eyes, wide with a fear she had never known, darted amongst the riders, searching, desperately searching, for the boy. And then she saw him, riding just behind the chief, his small hand gripping the reins of his own pony, his eyes fixed on her, unwavering. The sight of him, so alive, so defiantly present, brought a strange, complex wave of relief and renewed terror. He had returned, but with his entire tribe. The full weight of her impulsive act, the immense, unimaginable scope of its consequence, crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. The chief dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate, his gaze, as sharp as flint, fixed upon her. The silence that followed his dismount was more deafening than the thunder of hooves. A profound, tense hush, broken only by the snorting of horses and the ragged beat of her own heart. The chief stood before her, a towering figure against the setting sun, his presence radiating an ancient authority that both intimidated and commanded respect. His eyes, dark and piercing, held a profound intensity that seemed to peel away her very soul, revealing the raw, exposed nerves of her fear. Behind him, the entire tribe, a silent, imposing multitude, watched with an unnerving stillness, their faces unreadable masks. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt tangible, a palpable pressure bearing down upon her. Sarah, rooted to the spot, could not look away. This was the moment of truth, the climax of her unspoken dread. She braced herself for the inevitable accusations, the condemnation, the swift, brutal justice she had feared. Her own prejudices, deeply ingrained, painted him as a figure of vengeance, a manifestation of the violent narratives that had consumed her world. The boy, her rescue charge, dismounted and stepped forward, his small hand reaching out to touch the chief's arm, a silent, almost imperceptible gesture that conveyed an unspoken urgency. The chief's gaze softened, a flicker of something akin to paternal pride passing through his stern features. Then, he turned back to Sarah, his eyes once more unwavering. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant, the words alien to her ears, a guttural language she did not understand, yet the intensity of his tone, the gravitas in his delivery, left no doubt as to their profound significance. The boy stepped forward again, positioning himself between them, his gaze shifting from his chief to Sarah. He spoke then, his young voice clear and steady, using the few common words he had picked up, fragmented pieces of her language. She, good. She, save. His hand gestured towards the quicksand. Then, to her, a simple, eloquent narrative of her selfless act. The chief listened, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face, absorbing the boy's words, weighing them. The tension in the air, rather than dissipating, transformed, shifting into something new, something indefinable. The chief lifted his hand, palm open, a gesture of peace, not violence. He spoke again, his voice softer this time, but no less commanding. The boy translated, his words halting but earnest. My father, Chief Broken Hand, he honors you. You saved his son. You are sister. The word sister hung in the air, a shocking, unexpected balm. It shattered the edifice of her fear, the years of ingrained hatred, the rigid boundaries of their worlds. The emotional climax was not one of violence, but of profound recognition, a testament to a shared humanity that transcended the brutal divisions of their times. Tears, unbidden, pricked at Sarah's eyes, a hot, welcome release after days of stifled terror. The raw emotion of the moment, the sheer weight of his gratitude, was almost unbearable. It was an acknowledgement, not just of her mercy, but of her worth, a validation she hadn't realized she craved. The vast, silent tribe behind the chief remained impassive, but she sensed a subtle shift, a softening of their collective gaze, a silent acceptance. The world tilted on its axis, and for a fleeting moment, the chasm between their peoples seemed to narrow, bridged by a simple act of human kindness, a powerful echo of life saved and dignity restored. The air, thick moments ago with tension, now hummed with a fragile, almost ethereal peace. The chief, Broken Hand, his powerful gaze still upon Sarah, repeated a phrase in his own tongue, and the boy, his young face etched with a quiet pride, translated, You are kin now. Your spirit is strong, we remember. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of generations, a promise woven into the fabric of a people who never forgot a kindness or a wrong. Sarah, still reeling from the unexpected shift from terror to profound acknowledgement, could only nod, a silent acceptance of this extraordinary bond, forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. The sun, dipping fully below the horizon, painted the sky in streaks of deep violet and fiery orange, casting long, dramatic shadows across the assembly. The tribe, which had seemed so formidable in their arrival, began to move with a quiet, purposeful rhythm, establishing a temporary encampment near her cabin, a powerful visual metaphor for the sudden, dramatic shift in her solitary existence. Fires were lit, sending plumes of smoke curling towards the darkening sky, carrying the scent of unfamiliar herbs and roasting meat. Children, initially wary, peeked out from behind the legs of their elders, their eyes wide with curiosity. Women began to unpack bundles, setting up temporary dwellings with a practiced efficiency. It was a complete immersion, a sudden, overwhelming infusion of life and culture into her desolate world. For days, Sarah moved among them, a silent observer, and at times, a reluctant participant. The initial awe slowly gave way to a deeper understanding, a recognition of their complex humanity beyond the simplistic narratives of her own people. She saw the fierce love within families, the respect for elders, the intricate rituals that governed their lives. They were not the one-dimensional figures of terror, but a vibrant, resilient people, deeply connected to the land and to each other. The chief, through the boys' intermittent translations, conveyed his gratitude in various forms, offering game, sharing stories of their ancestors, drawing parallels between the harshness of the land and the strength of spirit required to survive it. There was no explicit discussion of the conflicts that raged beyond their camp, no mention of the societal prejudices that defined their interactions with the white world. Yet, the unspoken darkness of that reality lingered, a subtle undertone to their newfound peace. The tribe's presence, a tangible display of their power and gratitude, offered Sarah a fleeting sanctuary from the very forces she had once feared. She was no longer truly alone. The resolution, though hopeful, carried the weight of its own fragility. This was a moment suspended in time, an exception to the brutal rule of their world. What would happen when they departed? Would the fragile bridge of understanding hold, or would the chasm between their peoples widen once more, swallowing the memory of a boy saved from quicksand, and the woman who dared to save him? The legacy of her act, a single thread of mercy, had interwoven her life with theirs, forever altering the fabric of her isolated existence. It was a quiet triumph, a personal rebellion against the tide of hatred, but its true cost and lasting impact remained a question mark etched into the vast, indifferent landscape. She carried the weight of her choice, the burden of a secret alliance that could define her future, a symbol of hope in a world still steeped in darkness and conflict.